Thank you, everybody. I have to approve the recording of the meeting. Thank you so much for coming today. I'm really happy to be here. I want to thank Simon for inviting me. I want to thank Chris and Vera and Stefan for welcoming me and for all of you coming today. I grew up in the Northeast, and so I'm always really happy to come back to this part of the country, and of course, delighted to be in Manhattan for a couple of days. And to have such beautiful weather. Apparently you all think it's cold, but I think this is great. So I'm pretty happy. We're sort of bracing ourselves for winter. It was rough last year, so this feels wonderful. So today I'm going to be talking about the Multiliteracies framework as a critical pedagogy that can help teachers support social justice and language education. Louder? Oh, and I can hear a little bit of an echo. That's why yeah, okay. So I framed this as a research talk, but I do want to give you just a little bit of background about myself and how I came to be here working on this topic. I started working with multiliteracies pedagogy about 15 years ago after I read Rick Kern's amazing book, Literacy and Language Teaching. It is a book that completely transformed the way that I thought about language education. I read it and immediately started reading it a second time. It's that good. So if you've never read it, I highly recommend it. And I was really drawn to this pedagogy for two reasons. One was I was really interested in how to bridge the language content divide in post-secondary language programs, which I hear may be alive and well at this university. It's alive and well at mine. And so I was doing research on that, but I was also really interested in thinking about how to bring texts into lower level language instruction, but also bring language development into upper level language courses. And I had been working in process oriented instruction for a long time. But when I read about multiliteracies pedagogy, like all of the light bulbs went off. Like it just all made perfect sense for being able to do that for me. And then over time, I started becoming more interested in social justice topics. And it allowed me to kind of connect with the original intention of the multiliteracies framework, which is to really empower students to feel like agents in their own learning, to be able to question texts and the information within them, to be able to work with various text types through different types of thinking and learning activities. And so in 2019, I started working with a group of colleagues at the University of Minnesota to think about how to use multiliteracies pedagogy to more intentionally bring different types of content into lower level language courses. And we landed on topics of social justice, things like environmental sustainability, language policy, immigration, and so on. And our thinking evolved, and we applied for funding and received a grant to be able to support the work that I'm going to talk about today. And so we started developing materials. We were self-educating about social justice and language education. We started conducting research. So I say all of this to just underscore that I come here with a certain degree of expertise, but my learning is still ongoing. And I think it's particularly important to acknowledge that as a white person who is doing social justice work, that my knowledge is constantly evolving. And I know that you bring different positionalities and knowledge to this space as well. And so I'm really looking forward to our discussion after the talk and interacting with all of you. So for today's talk, I've framed it according to three questions. So why is the multiliteracies framework a viable critical pedagogy for implementing social justice in language classrooms? What facilitates and hinders teachers' implementation of this approach? And how can teachers be supported in carrying out this work? So to answer the first question, I will define multiliteracies pedagogy in relation to critical pedagogies and social justice, and provide a rationale for using this approach to enact social justice in language education. To answer the second question, I'll present findings from research that we've been conducting at Minnesota on teachers' understanding and enactment of social justice in language education through critical pedagogies, including the multiliteracies framework. And then to answer the third question, I'll talk a little bit more about practical implications of this research and the professional development resources that we've been developing at CARLA. So let's start by looking at some definitions that will help sort of situate the multiliteracies framework within critical pedagogies and social justice education. So I want to start by defining social justice. So this definition on the slide from Nieto is very commonly cited in the social justice literature. She defines social justice as a philosophy, an approach, and actions that embody treating all people with fairness, respect, dignity, and generosity. And this kind of general definition can also be thought of in terms of committing ourselves to identifying and dismantling inequities based on things like race, gender, sexual orientation, and so on, that promote a false hierarchy of human value. Thinking about social justice within the context of language education, we can further say that social justice involves promoting positive cross-national and cross-cultural understanding and enabling teachers and students to better understand or make progress toward equity in society as they engage with target languages and cultures. And the language piece is really important here, right? We as language educators really want to think about the power of language to either sustain or break down inequities in relation to social justice topics, not just culture, that this is something where language and culture are really intertwined. So moving on, let's look at critical pedagogies, which is a way to enact this definition of social justice or these definitions of social justice. So again, I'm going to start with a general definition and then move to something more specific related to language education. So we can say that critical pedagogies enable students to question knowledge, justice, power, issues of DEI. And in so doing, they can feel empowered and they can develop tools to sort of transform social structures, take action. To add on to this general definition, we can talk about critical pedagogies as going beneath the surface meaning of various issues, cliches, received wisdom, and so on, to gain deeper understanding, to understand root causes, social context, etc. And then within the context of language education, we can say that critical pedagogies prioritize language development for the purposes of engaging with target language cultures and recognizing students' multilingual and multicultural identities. Students aren't coming to us as homogeneous individuals. They all have different experiences. And critical pedagogies also problematize dominant assumptions about language, culture, language users, and social issues. So again, really underscoring the importance of language when we're thinking about not only social justice, but the critical pedagogies that we adopt to enact social justice in the language classroom. So now that we've got some general definitions, I want to talk a little bit about how multiliteracies pedagogy fits into all of this. So the multiliteracies framework, as many of you in this room know, provides a theoretical and pedagogical approach for developing students' foreign language literacies, which involves making form-meaning connection through the interpretation and creation of target language texts. This framework emphasizes the importance of linguistic and cultural diversity, preparing students to participate fully in public, academic, and workplace life, multimodal learning and communication that is written, audio, audiovisual, spatial, gestural, and teaching students to be designers of meaning through the study of language patterns and conventions and mapping those patterns and conventions onto what they already know about the language and on their own world views. In language education, we can enact multiliteracies pedagogy by engaging students in different kinds of thinking or knowledge processes. And those are depicted in the slide by the graphic. So this is experiencing, conceptualizing, analyzing, and applying. So experiencing a target language text involves exploring familiar and new ideas. So examples of experiencing activities might be things like brainstorming a list of vocabulary based upon the title of a text, or engaging in a think, pair, share activity where students express their opinions about one of the topics that's going to be addressed in a text, or even comprehension questions like a true-false questions or multiple choice questions where students are getting surface level comprehension of the text before they dive deeper and do textual analysis. Experiencing can also provide scaffolding for other knowledge processes that engage students in higher order thinking. So next we have conceptualizing, and this involves making form meaning connections by zooming in on the specific features of text. So the language features, the genre features, the organizational features. So examples might include concept mapping. So let's say students are interacting with a text that has 2 main themes. And then you have them scan the text and look for vocabulary words that relate to each of those themes. And then they use those words from the text to create a map of their understanding. And this is a way to deliberately connect language from the text with the main ideas of the text. Another example of conceptualizing would be text annotations. So students are maybe reading a chronological text and you have them go through and identify transition words and then make notes in the margins about how those transition words help their understanding of the chronology. Another example, if you're working with a video text, you could give students stills from the video and then lines from the text and have them connect the lines with the appropriate image and then talk a little bit about how those lines from the text convey the meaning that's depicted in the visual. So next we have analyzing. And so in analyzing activities, students question and contextualize the language and cultural content of texts. So whereas conceptualizing was really zooming in on textual details, analyzing is zooming out and kind of looking at the big picture and considering consequences, implications, etc. So analyzing would be something like critical focus questions, like the kinds of critical, like the what and how questions that you might ask after students understand a question, not what, a why and how questions that students might answer about a text. A debate where students take one side of an issue is an example of an analyzing activity. A genre comparison. So let's say students read an infographic about food practices in France, and then maybe they watch a video of somebody describing their daily routine of preparing meals or something. And then they could talk a little bit about how similar ideas are expressed in these genres differently and why. And who the audience might be, that kind of thing. And then finally, we can talk about applying activities. And so here's where students use the knowledge that they've gained through textual interpretation to create something new, to showcase their language skills. So an example would be rewriting a story from the perspective of a different character. So say they've read, I don't know, a fairy tale like Little Red Riding Hood or something like that, and they rewrite the story from the perspective of the grandmother. It could be creating a public service announcement. So maybe students have done a unit on environmental sustainability and they want to create a video, a PSA about how to be more environmentally aware on campus, like where recycling is and that kind of thing. Or maybe they're crafting a personal action plan. They've read a text on volunteering in their community. And so they create a plan on how they can incorporate volunteering into their own daily life. So these key multiliteracies principles that I've just talked through reflect the definitions of critical pedagogies and social justice that I presented on the previous 2 slides. This pedagogy goes beyond surface level understanding to explore the deep meaning and ideas and perspectives presented in texts. It fosters critical reflection about relationships between meaning and the language forms used to express that meaning. It prepares learners to interact with the range of text types that they will encounter in various aspects of their lives, not just their academic life. It recognizes the socially situated nature of language use, the cultural perspectives language and texts convey, and how they might contribute to or challenge linguistic and social marginalization. Multiliteracies pedagogy also allows us to value multiple language varieties and language users and acknowledges that language can signal both individual differences and group membership or exclusion. And finally, it draws on the range of knowledge and competencies that multiliterate individuals possess, including the ability to draw on a repertoire of meaning-making resources, to participate in different literacy practices, to problem solve, question, and think critically. So to further underscore that multiliteracies pedagogy is a critical approach appropriate for enacting social justice in language education, I want to talk about another critical pedagogy, and that's Hackman's 5 components of social justice education. So at CARLA, we've been using this approach in tandem with multiliteracies pedagogy to develop social justice instructional templates and curricular units that I'll talk about a little bit later in the talk. So the 5 components of Hackman's model, which are depicted by the graphic on the slide, are content mastery, critical analysis, action and social change, personal reflection, and multicultural group dynamics. So the first four, content, so the ones that are sort of on the outer part of the graphic, work together to build students' understanding of social justice topics, to cultivate their ability to analyze and question factual information and systems of power and inequity, to act in ways that challenge these systems of oppression, and to think critically about the impact of their thoughts, words, and actions. Engagement in these four types of activities also must take into consideration students' multicultural and multilingual identities, because these inform their learning, and that's represented by that circle, right? So the overlapping circle there shows that multicultural group dynamics need to be considered whenever we're enacting these kinds of activities so that our students feel included and seen and heard, and we're bringing content into the classroom that acknowledges those identities. So there are synergies across all four knowledge processes of multiliteracies pedagogy and the components of Hackman's model. I'd like to focus in on two from each of the approaches to kind of show a little bit more why multiliteracies pedagogy is in line with definitions of social justice and critical pedagogy. So on the left-hand side, you have the knowledge processes of conceptualizing and analyzing from the multiliteracies framework. And then the right-hand side, the components of Hackman's model that are critical analysis and personal reflection. So just to refresh, conceptualizing is about making form meaning connections through text. So students do things like categorize, classify, define terms, connect concepts. In analyzing activities, I guess I should also remind everyone that conceptualizing is the zooming in and looking at the specifics. The analyzing is zooming out and looking at the big picture. And so this is where students are questioning the complexity and consequences of text. They're explaining patterns. They're taking into consideration different perspectives, and they're trying to understand the intent behind a text and the messages that it conveys. So similarly, when we think about critical reflection, critical analysis and personal reflection, this is where students explain how language connects to perspectives, oppression, and marginalization. They look at multiple perspectives, including their own. They can decenter their own perspective while thinking about the way other people experience the world. They can critique systems of power and inquire into alternatives to these systems. And then with personal reflection, it's really about thinking how they situate themselves in relation to social justice content. Together, these two sets of activities are part of an instructional process that encourages students to consider multiple perspectives, positionalities, power dynamics, and possibilities with respect to textual content. And they furthermore cultivate what Hackman calls deep knowledge of language, culture, and justice. And finally, they encourage learners to explore meaning-making systems so that they can, in the words of Cope and Kalantzis, two of the originators of multiliteracies pedagogy, critically interrogate the interests of participants in the communication process and analyze the complex linguistic and cultural diversity of texts and the societies they represent. So in short, these four activity types in particular and multiliteracies pedagogy more generally realize the critical part of critical pedagogies and make it possible to prioritize social justice in language education. So now that we have a sense of why the multiliteracies framework is a viable critical pedagogy for enacting social justice, I want to move on to the second question, which is what facilitates and hinders teachers' implementation of this approach. So in this part of the talk, I'm going to shift to talking about research that we've been doing on teachers' understanding and implementation of social justice in language education through multiliteracies and pedagogy and Heather Hackman's model. So for the past 3 years, my colleagues and I have been working with a couple of cohorts of teachers to create social justice instructional units grounded in both multiliteracies and social justice pedagogies. And I think I mentioned at the start, in 2020, we were awarded International Research and Studies Program grant from the US Department of Education to create a suite of materials to support social justice in language education. So this has included instructional planning templates, social justice curricular units in 9 languages, a bibliography of practical and scholarly resources, a searchable text repository, and how-to webinars. And I'll talk a little bit more about those when I get to the professional development part. At the same time that we've been creating these materials, we've been researching the people who've been creating them to understand how they understand the critical pedagogies that we've been using and how they implement them in the classroom. So we've collected data from 2 cohorts of instructors. The first cohort was teachers of the commonly taught languages of French, German, and Spanish. The second cohort is from teachers of the less commonly taught languages of Chinese, Portuguese, Russian, and Turkish. There are additional less commonly taught languages in the project, but they did not consent to participate in our research. And the research that we're doing is framed by the overarching question that you see on the slide: how do post-secondary language teachers understand and implement social justice in language education? So the timeline that you have here is for our first cohort of instructors, but we're following the same timeline and collecting the same data from the second cohort. That research is still in progress. We're wrapping up that study this year. So I just going to briefly talk through our timeline because it will give you a sense of the work that we've been doing and then how we've been researching that work. So our project began late in the fall of 2020 with professional development that spanned into the spring 2021 semester. We did professional development on both social justice pedagogy and multiliteracies pedagogy. And this involved workshops and some self-study modules for folks who were not familiar with multiliteracies pedagogy. And so in late fall, when we began the professional development, we had participants complete an initial questionnaire that collected demographic information as well as information about their understanding of social justice, the way that they implement social justice in their language classrooms, as well as their identity in relation to social justice. We're doing another study on teacher identity as well. And then at the end of the professional development, so in late spring 2021, we conducted an initial interview to expand upon the responses from the questionnaire. In summer 2021, the French, German, and Spanish instructors developed a social justice curricular unit on a topic of their choice. And throughout the summer, they worked closely with one member of my research team to do individual consultations about the development of their project. And so we recorded those individual consultations. And we also had 3 group work sessions, which we also recorded. And at the group work sessions, we sort of puzzled through common problems that everybody was having, mostly related to assessment, which I can talk about during the Q&A if you're curious. Then during the 21-22 academic year, these French, German, and Spanish instructors piloted the units that they created. And we went in and observed. So we observed 2 to 3 class sessions for each curricular unit. The units spanned about 2 to 3 weeks. And we took notes and recorded the observations. And then once the units were completed, the piloting was completed, we conducted a debriefing interview where we asked some of the same questions from our initial interview and also did kind of a stimulated recall of the teaching that they had done. And then finally, in summer 2022, they revised the units based upon the piloting feedback that they had received from social justice consultants on the project, and feedback that they had received on me from their application of multiliteracies pedagogy. And they again had individual consultations with a member of the grant team, which we recorded. And then when they turned in the revised unit, we had them complete a final questionnaire that repeated the same questions from the initial questionnaire, minus the demographics. Okay, so that's the data. Our participants, we have 8 participants in our study. The ones in blue are the ones that I'm going to be talking about today. These are the French, German, and Spanish instructors. And you can see that they're all L1 speakers of English. They're also all white women. And you can see that Fiona, and I should also mention that they are all coordinators of a multi-section course. And that was why they were selected, because we knew that they were going to have some agency over the curriculum in terms of developing a social justice unit that they would actually be able to implement. So you can see that Fiona and Haley had a little bit less teaching experience and a little bit less coordinating experience than Kim and Samantha, who are in the later stages of their career, and so had a lot of teaching and coordination experience. We used a multiple case study methodology to conduct this research, and we've analyzed our data using multi-cycle descriptive and analytic coding, and have situated the findings within concepts of sociocultural theory. The findings that I present today are draw from our ongoing work, some of which is featured in the 2 articles at the bottom of the slide. So the first one is on early view now with foreign language annals. The second one just came out in second language research and practice. I have a QR code on my last slide if you're interested in my bibliography. So you'll have access to that. Okay, so in what follows, I'm going to share what we've learned about how teachers understand and implement social justice through multiliteracies pedagogy. And then I'm going to highlight some of the affordances and constraints that the teachers encountered as they did this work. So first, I want to kind of explain what we learned about why our participants think it's important to center social justice in language education. So for them, social justice is important for developing the whole person, which involves acknowledging and celebrating different aspects of students' identities, as well as the identities and cultural perspectives represented in target language texts. As this quote from Samantha illustrates, participants saw social justice as important for raising awareness of a diversity of experiences and perspectives. For Samantha, doing this helps students to dialogue across difference through open discussion and critical conversation. For Fiona, this meant the potential for her classroom practice to positively impact society. As she said, the more aware people are of all these different dynamics that have been hidden from especially groups of privilege, it can sort of help folks be more empathetic, fight for equality, fight for equity. Our findings have also helped us understand what is important to teachers when they're designing social justice instructional materials. One important consideration is finding a balance between attention to language and attention to social justice content. And this, I see heads nodding, so some of you can probably relate to this. And finding this balance was a challenge for all of our participants. However, we saw 2 divergent orientations. In line with multiliteracies principles, Fiona and Haley, who were the less experienced of the 4 instructors, saw opportunities for exploring how language and content could be intertwined through the materials they were developing. But Kim and Samantha, who were more influenced by traditional expectations around accuracy and the teaching of language forms, saw more separation between language and content. As this quote illustrates, the balance or lack thereof between language and content was a conundrum for Kim as she planned instruction. She asked herself, is it worth spending all this time to get them to create sentences grammatically accurate? Or is the time better spent engaging them in these ideas and thinking about the cultural and social justice issues? So really separating these 2 things out in that question. Centering texts, a key aspect of multiliteracies pedagogy, was another important factor in our participants' instructional design. For them, using text was essential for building students' background knowledge about the social justice topics that they were teaching. And they also saw text as a way of integrating diverse perspectives into the classroom, in particular those other than their own. Very strange creaking going on over here. As Fiona explained, it's hard as a non-Hispanic white woman to talk about social justice. So she relied on texts, in this case, multiple forms of artwork, to allow students to connect dots from the artists themselves who had a particular message. In this way, text helped Fiona mitigate discomfort with her own positionality by bringing voices from the target culture into the classroom. So in addition to gaining insights into how participants approached material design, we also learned about how they implemented the materials that they created. Participants' comments reflect a sequential view of instruction that moves from building content knowledge to engaging students in critical analysis through activities reflecting the critical pedagogies of the project. For instance, when Samantha described implementing a unit on migration in Germany, she talked about starting with the facts and building from there. As she said, there's all this concrete factual information that they'll learn, and that's good. But then we analyze what people said about the refugees, and I think they'll understand it a lot more. The sequential progression was reflected in Samantha's instructional materials, which relied heavily on the knowledge process of experiencing in early lessons of the curricular unit, and only later moved towards conceptualizing and analyzing activities. At the same time, the teachers in our study recognized that content mastery alone is insufficient, and that they also have to help their students delve deeper into social justice topics. And I use the phrase delve deeper intentionally. That came up in our participants' language when they talked about the units that they had developed. Fiona talked about reflection, which is a type of analyzing activity in multiliteracies pedagogy, as a way to help students process as they're learning. She emphasized the importance of social action and advocacy as well, developed through the knowledge processes of analyzing and applying. As she explained, I've noticed in previous lessons where I didn't include that, meaning analyzing and applying, they became like that poor, pitiful group, and it doesn't provide a more comprehensive picture of what's really going on. Our findings related to how participants understand and enact social justice in language education are also associated with a number of affordances and constraints that either help or hinder teachers' ability to implement social justice in language education through the pedagogies I've been discussing today. So as we saw in the data that I just presented, awareness of diverse perspectives and marginalized voices was an important affordance for our participants. Interestingly, although they identified the representation of different identities as a benefit of social justice education, they found their own identities as white women to hinder their confidence and their ability to treat some social justice topics in depth. Our findings also revealed that texts are an affordance that can provide rich sources of linguistic and cultural knowledge. And this makes sense, given that texts are at the core of multiliteracies pedagogy, and they were central to the curricular units that our participants created. Although texts were an affordance, the integration of language and content was a constraint, as I mentioned. So, here we go. As we saw in the findings that I presented, some participants were able to balance the language and content goal of language classes, whereas others struggled to make this connection. Relatedly, some of our participants found moving beyond content mastery to do the critical analysis work needed in these pedagogies was really challenging, particularly at the start when they were initially developing their curricular units. Later in the project, however, participants gained confidence in their ability to design these analyzing activities. And this was in part facilitated by participants' buy-in of the pedagogical frameworks that we were asking them to use, including multiliteracies pedagogy. Participants also found that making connections to local contexts and current events afforded their ability to design and implement social justice instructional materials. And this is really relevant for our study because it took place in Minneapolis following the murder of George Floyd and the riots and uprising that ensued, and coincided with the Derek Chauvin trial. So this was really at the front of people's minds when they were doing this work. These local contexts and current events also weighed heavily on our participants, and one constraint arising from our findings was the mental and emotional bandwidth required to thoughtfully plan and enact social justice in language education. In addition to living through the upheaval in our city, participants were treating challenging topics, grappling with their identities as white women, and encountering pushback from different stakeholders in their language program. Relatedly, the context of the language program was a constraint because participants struggled with how to integrate social justice into multi-section courses, most of whose curricula were grounded in textbooks. And these textbooks not only lacked a social justice focus, but also were not aligned with the critical pedagogies that they were using to create the curricular units. Finally, time was a significant constraint for our students. So first of all, finding texts is very time consuming, as we were talking about before I began talking today. So it was very time consuming for them to find the materials that they were going to teach. But relatedly, finding enough class time to really go deeply into text and do the kind of textual analysis that they were trying to do was hard. And what ended up happening actually in the revisions was that many of the curriculum developers took out a lot of the original content so that they could have more time to delve deeper into the text that they kept in their curricular units. I do want to mention that these affordances and constraints that I've summarized on the slide are not unique to the participants in our study. Findings from the previous research listed here shows that the design of social justice activities is facilitated by finding and working with appropriate cultural artifacts, including target language texts, but is also constrained by the time and effort required to develop high quality activities. In addition, studies of teacher-created multiliteracies materials shows that conceptualizing and analyzing, the two knowledge processes of multiliteracies pedagogy that facilitate deep and critical work with social justice content, are underrepresented and challenging to create. And finally, previous research shows that implementation of social justice activities is facilitated by environmental factors such as curricular freedom, positive student reaction, and teachers' own critical awareness. Yet implementation is constrained by factors such as fear of pushback and teacher comfort level. So all of these findings from previous studies came out in our research as well. So with these affordances and constraints in mind, I want to move to the final question framing the talk, which is how can teachers be supported in using multiliteracies pedagogy to teach for social justice? So to maximize the affordances that were on the previous slide and mitigate the constraints observed in our findings, impactful professional development is essential. And so that's what I'm really going to focus on now. So through our data analyses, we learned that participants found collaboration with others through things like one-on-one meetings, group work sessions, and the like, a very compelling form of professional development that supported their work throughout the grant project. They furthermore highlighted the impact of instructional models, such as sample lessons and activities, and opportunities for deepening their conceptual understanding, such as reading groups and workshops, on their ability to understand and implement multiliteracies and other critical pedagogies. Towards the beginning of their curricular development work, participants identified several additional professional development needs, including how to incorporate social justice in small ways into their everyday teaching, how to find relevant and impactful texts, and how to develop deeper conceptual understanding of the pedagogies framing the project. They really did grapple with these pedagogies, which are kind of abstract and very different from communicative language teaching, which is what most of us all grew up with when we learned to be language teachers. Toward the end of the project, however, after the units had been created, piloted, and revised, our participants also explained that they needed professional development support in 4 main areas. So balancing language development and the discussion of social justice content. So again, back to this language content divide. Going deeper into social justice topics through conceptualizing and analyzing activities, handling critical moments in the classroom when you get pushback from your students, and integrating advocacy and real-world relevance into summative assessments. And I mentioned that assessment was something that came up as a problem for our participants. With the curricular units that they developed, we asked them to create a final action-oriented summative assessment. And this was tricky for them. As coordinators of a multi-section course, they had a hard time thinking about how an action-oriented assessment would work across multiple sections. But they were really thinking a lot about having the students actually go out into the community and do something action-oriented. And so we tried to sort of steer them toward developing tools for students to enact, what do I want to say? Equipping them with tools to be able to take action after leaving the language classroom. So they ended up landing on things like developing artwork that represented different cultural perspectives and doing a gallery walk and inviting members of the community into the classroom, or creating a dictionary of terms to help students be able to navigate how language is used to manipulate in the press, Or I'm trying to think of another example. Oh, another one did a project on proposing more green spaces in their community. So they didn't actually go out and create the green spaces or connect with the community when they did this, but they thought about how they might do this if they were to take action in this way. So again, these professional development needs that came out in our findings are consistent with previous research, which argues that professional development should first and foremost be coherent and sustained. And this has been argued for over and over and again in the teacher professional development literature. So coherent in that professional development experience should be connected by common themes and approaches like social justice and multiliteracies pedagogy, and sustained in that these experiences must take place over time. It takes a long time to learn new approaches. It takes a long time to appropriate concepts and then apply them in instruction. Relatedly, the sustained model of professional development should be grounded in praxis, P-R-A-X-I-S. So this is a sociocultural concept that involves the dialogic relationship between theory and practice. Our findings show, for instance, that participants moved from sussing out the details of social justice and multiliteracies pedagogies at the start of the study, so the theory side, toward reflection on how these details might be enacted through materials development and classroom practice, so the practice side of praxis. And this wasn't a one-way kind of thinking, it was back and forth, and it's interesting to watch their thinking evolve when you look at the findings over time. Our data also show that a one-size-fits-all model of professional development does not account for teachers' differing needs or for their past experiences and multiple identities that they bring to teaching. Rather, what we like to call a mixed methods approach to professional development is ideal. So this kind of approach involves various types of resources and experiences, and I'll talk about some of those on the next slide, or maybe in 2 slides, I can't remember. And it allows teachers to select and use these professional development experiences and resources in ways that are meaningful to them as individuals. And then, as I've already mentioned, the cohort model of professional development embedded in this project provided opportunities for community building. In particular, connections with members of the grant team and with other curriculum developers in their own language and in other languages were key to supporting teachers as they created these curricular units. And previous research has emphasized the importance of community building and collaborative materials creation. And so it's just an essential part of any PD program. And I know you have community here through the LRC, and I can imagine how wonderful of a support that is for you to feel like you're not alone in the work that you're doing. Finally, the data that I've presented today suggests that flexibility is key when supporting teachers as they create curricular materials. And I didn't mention this when I was talking about the findings, but some participants had negative reactions, to put it mildly, to the social justice instructional templates that we asked them to work with. They found these materials restrictive. They felt like they limited their creativity and encouraged a prescriptive view of social justice and multiliteracies pedagogy. And we listened to them and we modified the templates to make them more flexible before we published them online. Flexibility was also a theme arising from participants' comments after they had piloted and received feedback on their units. And having the ability to engage in trial and error and to revise the materials that they had created was really key to increasing their buy-in and their agency in relation to social justice and multiliteracies approaches. So in response to these research findings and implications, we've been carrying out a number of activities at CARLA to support language educators wishing to teach for social justice through multiliteracies pedagogy. So I'm going to talk about 3 different types of supports that we've been working on. So the first strand is professional development, then materials, and then research. So in terms of professional development, we, in the fall of 2022, launched a workshop series on social justice. We designed it in response to a focus group that we conducted with language educators from typically underrepresented groups in language education, who said that they wanted professional development that focused on ways to make small changes for big impact when it came to social justice. And so each workshop focuses on a different social justice topic. and provides tips and tools for making small tweaks to enact this social justice topic. So the first workshop was in fall 2022. It was on disability in language education. The second one was last spring, and it was on centering Asian voices in the language classroom. We just had one last month on LGBTQ+ representation. In the spring, the topic will be anti-racism and centering Blackness. Following each workshop, we have a professional learning community where attendees can interact with one another, create community around the topic that they have explored in the workshop. Our graduate research assistant runs this, and she has a Canvas page where people can interact asynchronously, and then they have 2 synchronous meetings following the workshop where they talk through ideas, they work on materials together. And then we have invited some of the PLC, the professional learning community participants, to be interviewed for a podcast series that basically features practitioner voices. We really wanted to center teachers in all of this work. And the podcast episodes will be published on We Teach Languages, which is Stacey Johnson's podcast out of Vanderbilt University. Some of you may be familiar with that. We just recorded the first 2 episodes, and we hope that they will be up online in the next couple of months. And then the last piece of professional development is the CARLA Summer Institute program. So for many years, we have offered a week-long summer institute led by Cassie Glynn, Beth Wassel, and Pam Wesley, who are the authors of Actful's book, Words in Action, Teaching Language Through the Lens of Social Justice. I think that's the full title. This coming summer in 2024, for the first time, I'm going to move because I can't, there we go. Now, there we go. That's better. So in 2024, for the first time, we will be offering a 3-day summer institute on the templates that we've developed at CARLA. And it's called, I have information right here if anybody wants a flyer, Planning Social Justice Lessons, Critical Pedagogies in Action. So we're really excited about this. And what we'll be doing is alternating this summer institute with the one that Cassie, Beth, and Pam teach, so that we'll have different offerings on alternate summers. In terms of materials, I've already talked a little bit about what we've done, but I want to just describe them a little bit more. So the first thing that we did when we started working on this project was to start creating planning templates. And so we have 3 templates. One is for an overall curricular unit. We have a lesson planning template, and then we have a summative assessment template and a model rubric for the summative assessment. And those are the templates that our curriculum developers have used to design these curricular units. So we're going to have curricular units in 9 languages. We've already published units in French, German, and Spanish. Later this semester, we're going to be publishing Arabic, Portuguese, and Russian. And then within the next year or so, we anticipate publishing, we hope in the next year or so, Chinese, Dutch, and Turkish. So that's kind of exciting. We're really excited about all the different languages that are involved. The other thing that we've been doing is creating how-to webinars. So last December, we did a webinar on how to use the instructional planning templates. This December, we are doing one on how to implement the social justice curricular units. So this webinar will feature the curriculum developers, and they'll talk about their experiences implementing these units in intermediate level language classrooms. We are also working on a text repository. So we had folks over the summer work on researching target language texts in the themes that are common in intermediate level language curricula. So things like family, professions, identity, technology, that kind of thing. And we are creating a searchable database of these texts, and you'll be able to search by language, by social justice theme, by grammar forms, and by vocabulary. So if you're looking for a text in Chinese that addresses family and you want it to be in the preterite, you can search and see if that comes up. It might not come up, but I think we have something like 300 texts that will be part of the repository. We don't have it in all of the languages of the project, but we have it in most of the languages of the project. I think we'll have it in French, German, Spanish, Portuguese, Russian, Chinese, and Turkish. Those are the languages of the text. So that's coming soon. We also have an activity repository that's part of our literacies initiative, not our social justice initiative. The activity repository is organized according to the 4 knowledge processes of multiliteracies pedagogy. So if you're creating a lesson using that approach and you're like, I need a really good analyzing activity, you can go to the repository and there are explanations of different activity types that fall under each of the knowledge process. And they're all contextualized within whole lessons so that you can see how the activity is used in a lesson. So that's there, that's already up. And then we also, I think I mentioned, have a social justice bibliography of scholarly and practical resources. So it's organized into 3 main rubrics. One is just general social justice resources, one is social justice and language education resources, and one is language specific resources. And I can't remember which languages we have resources for. And then finally, in terms of research, I mentioned we're wrapping up our study of the Lichtel teachers. We expect to be working with that data starting next summer. I also mentioned that we've been collecting data related to teachers' identity in relation to social justice. And so we're just now starting to share and publish those findings. If you're going to AAAL, I'll be presenting on that data in March. And we've also collected classroom implementation data. We're not exactly sure what we're going to do with that, but maybe someday we'll publish something on that too. And then we're designing a new study that we're going to implement in the spring on students' critical language awareness as they experience these social justice units. And we'll design another study over the summer that will look at students' language use as they engage in activities through multiliteracies pedagogy. We're really interested in understanding whether and how they use language differently in experiencing versus conceptualizing versus analyzing versus applying activities. So that'll be a much larger study. So there's a lot going on at CARLA right now. So just to kind of wrap things up, my aim today was to share with you how multiliteracies pedagogy can be used to teach for social justice in language classrooms. This is ongoing and multidimensional work that involves understanding the multiliteracies framework as a critical pedagogy, examining how teachers conceptualize and enact social justice in language education and the affordances and constraints they experience along the way, and supporting teachers through professional development, materials creation, and research-based understandings. And I want to, before I stop, I just want to acknowledge all the people who are involved in this project. I'm working with amazing colleagues at Minnesota. I co-lead our literacies initiative with Mandy Menke. She's in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese Studies, and I co-lead the social justice initiative with Mandy, Lauren Goodspeed, who's my colleague in French, and Helena Roof, who's my colleague in German. And we've also had 3 really great graduate research assistants whose names are listed on the slide. If you're interested in the bibliography from today's talk, you can just scan the QR code and you'll get all of the references that I mentioned today. Thank you so much. I'm really looking forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you, Kate, for this very rich and very important talk on a very important topic. I'm going to open it up for questions and comments. A couple of things. Please speak in the microphone so that the people on the other side can pick up your comments. And please introduce yourselves so Kate knows who you are and where you're coming from. Chris and Simon, are you going to handle questions coming from the Zoom? You will. So I open it up to anyone. Should I stop screen
sharing? Yeah, okay. Yeah, I don't know what happened. I had it muted and it just somehow stopped. So it's still echoing. I don't know why.
A first question from someone? Go ahead.
Oh, wow, there's a lot of people online. Good.
Thank you, Professor. I have a question from Fumiko Nazikian. She is with Columbia in the Japanese language program. And the question is as follows. I have a question about the teacher's positionality in the classroom. When dealing with sensitive or controversial views, do you think teachers should stay neutral?
Oh, yeah, that's a hard opening question. I don't know what's going on with the sound. Is it there? It's really echoey. There are two schools of thought about this. So some people think, yes, they should remain neutral. Other people talk about language teaching as a political act. I mean, if you're really espousing critical pedagogies, I mean, Freire said this, teaching is a political act. And so I think the way that I like to answer this question is to say that our focus needs to be on the students and giving them tools to think critically about these issues and moderating discussions around those issues. That's my safe answer to that question. It's a complicated question. I think, yeah, I think there's lots of different ways to looking at it. And I think what we've learned from our research is there's a lot of teacher discomfort around teaching for social justice, and that if being neutral in the beginning is helpful, then why not, as long as you're still staying true to your intent of really teaching for social justice and really enacting critical pedagogies.
Hi, I'm Juan, so I teach Korean here.
Thanks.
I think I can.
It's for the people.
It's for the people. tonight.
So yeah.
Yeah.
There are 20 people in the room.
Oh, I didn't
A
know.
lot of people.
Okay.
Yeah.
So following up on Fumiko's question, so in your data set, did your participants experience any kind of resistance from their own students or their, co-teaching, teachers? It's not just the critical moments dealing with in classroom. It's all, some students have a different ideas about language learning experiences. They might say, why am I doing this? So can you share any kind of episodes?
Yeah. So the short answer is no, we didn't. Our teachers
okay.
didn't experience any sort of critical moments. That said, I think they did. I mean, we actually observed one. We were in a class that was on environmental sustainability and green spaces in cities, and the professor was talking about heat and the impact of heat on the way that people live and the need to have access to green spaces to be able to help combat the heat. And some kid made an offhand comment about, well, why don't they just turn on the air conditioning? And it was, the teacher didn't address it. She glossed over it. I think because, again, it was this sort of fear of creating more of a critical moment. And that came out a lot in our data. The teachers really didn't want to push back when there were those kinds of comments in the classroom. There was another one, we observed a class on linguistic insecurity. It was in Francophone Louisiana. And one of the students made a snide comment about the quality of one of the speakers' French accent, because they were from Louisiana. They spoke French differently. It wasn't standard hexagonal French. And the teacher turned it into an opportunity. That teacher handled it differently. It's a younger teacher. It was one of our, in fact, both of these examples, the first one is from one of our more experienced teachers, and then this example is from our less experienced younger teacher. And she kind of saw it as a teaching moment, like, well, why do you think his accent's different? And if we say this about his accent, how does that connect to the issue of linguistic security and linguistic insecurity? Have you ever been in a situation where somebody made fun of your accent? So she took it and made it into a teachable moment. But we did see a lot of concern for those kinds of things. We had one participant in particular who described herself as conflict avoidant. And so even though she was passionate about social justice in both her personal life and her professional life, she was very, very nervous about going deeply into these analysis activities. And her strategy for overcoming that was to over-prepare for teaching. She was so knowledgeable. She spent hours and hours and hours and hours researching her topic so that she could handle any possible question or comment from a student, because she was also very concerned with allowing all students to be able to express their opinion, whether it was from the left, from the right, someplace in between. And so her strategy was to just be completely over prepared. Yeah, it's really interesting. It's actually what I'm working on right now. So I love the question because my brain is in that data right now. So yeah, thank you for asking that. Yeah.
Okay, there's another question coming from the Zoom audience. This one is from Ji Young Jung, also from the Korean language program. I found that it is extremely difficult to incorporate the multiliteracies pedagogy in beginning level classes. Not impossible, but very challenging for many reasons. Can you share an example of successful scenario or lesson at a beginning level?
So I have to start the answer to this question by saying that my experience is with languages that have Roman scripts. So I've never taught a language with a non-Roman script. We were talking about this before the talk. So I can't provide an example for a language like Korean or Chinese or Russian. But I think what I've learned working with teachers is that it's analyzing that tends to be the knowledge process that is the sticking point in the lower levels, because learners don't have the linguistic proficiency to be able to talk about complex things in the language. And so there's a couple ways to mitigate that. I'm not really answering the question by providing an example. I'm going to talking more about strategies. So there's some ways to mitigate that. One is to use English. Sometimes people gasp when I say that. But if you're adhering to a 90% use of the target language or not, I don't know how you run things here. That would be a place for using your 10% English, is because it's pedagogically sound. So that's one strategy. But the other is, I think that we can do really complex kinds of activities, but make them less complex by providing students with sentence starters or providing them with options for answers to critical questions, or asking them to provide lists of words as opposed to complete sentences. So those are strategies for leveling down. So an example would be something like, there's an example in our book of a grumpy cat meme. And so there's a picture of grumpy cat looking grumpy, and grumpy says, good morning, ? No such thing. And so we organized a novice level lesson around this. And so I think the first activity was to show the meme with just the image and not the words, and have students describe grumpy cat and why might he be grumpy. Then to show the actual words and have students, so that first activity is an experiencing activity. Then show the words and have students explain, talk about, is good morning something that you learn? Is this an appropriate response when somebody says good morning to you? What are appropriate responses that you learned in your textbook? Why would grumpy cat respond this way? What about grumpy cat's demeanor indicates to you that he's being humorous and sarcastic? And those could all be multiple choice questions if you wanted them to be. And then, and maybe that was also part of the analyzing, and then they create their own meme. So they have to write their own meme. So that's a very, very simple 4-activity lesson that allows novice learners to experience multiliteracies pedagogy. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your talk. I'm Barbara Spinelli from the Department of Italian. And so I was thinking about, the first question is how the students were involved in this project, if they were, in terms of, we have heard the voice of the teacher, and what was he or she was, they were experimenting this, social justice based unit. And did they have feedback from students? Yeah. Did they ask, because, the two voices is the more objective way, to, sure, to see. I was thinking about, the multiliteracy framework, the designing social future for future social futures. Yeah. So what is the impact of this kind of work on the students, and what is their perception of this kind of work? I think is very, very important. Yeah. And I was thinking, also an interview which I read to Alan Luke, who was a member of the New London group, and is a little bit critical of the focus a lot of multiliteracy pedagogy. in terms that he says that if you really focus on a very structured method, the risk is to focus on skills and competencies and to neglect a little bit the critical awareness or identity work, which was really the focus of the initial thought about multiliteracy approach to education. So I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, so let me answer the second question first, and then I'll go to the first question because it's related to what you asked too. So, which I realized I didn't answer, so I'm sorry. And maybe you'll be able to remind me of the first question. So for the second question, I think our way of thinking about multiliteracies pedagogy is not prescriptive. So I know that the knowledge processes are always presented in the same order, but they can really be implemented in any order that makes sense. You don't need to have every knowledge process in every lesson. I think the important thing is that you need to have them all at some point. Otherwise, you're not doing multiliteracies pedagogy and you're not doing critical analysis, right? So I would disagree with the prescriptive thing. I also wonder what I think the folks who came up with multiliteracies pedagogy conceived it for first language literacy development, right? It was really for young learners who were coming through schools in Australia and being able to provide more equitable access to education for them, right? And so that's a much different perspective than what we're dealing with in world language classrooms here in the United States. So I think that's another important contextual factor. I also think in terms of the identity piece, that's really where the overlap with Hackman's model is really nice because it brings in that multicultural group dynamics. And so I feel like that really enriches the way that we can think about the multiliteracies framework and acknowledge that original intent of the pedagogy. So that has been for me the biggest benefit of using both of those approaches. So the first question was about students. Okay, so the answer is yes and no in terms of getting student reactions. So we, as part of our grant project, were required to evaluate the work that we were doing, and so we worked with a grant evaluator who helped us create surveys to administer to students at the beginning and at the end of each curricular unit. So in that way, we got some student feedback, and what we found was that the results mostly trended positive. That is, they had a more positive perception of issues of social justice at the end of the unit than they did at the beginning of the unit. I can't remember the specific items that were more positive, but my hunch is that ones that were connecting language and social justice had less increase in positivity over time for two reasons. And this gets at your question. One is, I think they might have been wondering, like, this is completely different from everything else we're doing in the curriculum. What's going on, right? Because the rest of the curriculum was organized around a textbook and traditional sort of grammar content, and then this gets plopped in, right? So it's a little bit anomalous in the overall curriculum, so it might have felt really different for them. And in fact, one of our participants felt that it was so anomalous with the rest of the curriculum that she decided not to continue teaching the social justice unit because it was too much of a shift. And what was the other? Oh, the other reason why I suspect that maybe questions that we're asking about connections between language and social justice for students probably didn't have an upward trend is because the curriculum developers struggled to bring language in. As I mentioned in the findings, this language content division was real in this project. And so they really struggled to see how they could bring linguistic content into these social justice lessons in a way that was meaningful and that was going to advance students' language proficiency and linguistic accuracy. So my guess is that students didn't see those connections. I agree with you that we need to look at student perspective, and that's what we're going to do next. Doing those simultaneously was too hard. We were going to do both studies at the same time, but then we realized that it probably wasn't fair to the curriculum developers to collect student data while they were piloting. That we really wanted them to have an opportunity to try them out, to revise, to feel confident with what they were doing. to feel more confident with the pedagogies before we started looking at the student data. Yeah. Yeah.
Just them, to see if what was the impact of their own work for them in
Yeah,
order to
yeah.
reply to your questions. I would have done that because I cannot say
Right.
this is my own voice, but I'm working with students and
Right.
it's a kind of collaborative co-construction,
Yeah, yeah.
of meanings.
Yeah.
So they should, have a voice. I think that is my,
Yeah.
point of view.
So most of the units included a reflection component
Okay.
where students were doing that kind of thinking. And in fact, in this study that we're going to be doing next semester, we're going to be collecting those reflections so that we can see their thinking and their perceptions of these social justice units. So yeah. That was happening. We just didn't see that. That was work that the teachers were collecting, but we didn't see that data. Yeah, those assignments that they completed. Yeah. So I think I got, yeah, okay. I got more questions. Yeah, Chris.
So as Barbara was asking her question, we could hear a voice of protest coming
Yeah.
from College Walk, which is
Exciting.
a common sound, a frequent sound today on Columbia's campus. And I was thinking about how you discussed the launch of this project, or the development of this project, was taking place during another high temperature time on campus. I'm certain was the case. Could you kind of reflect maybe on the relationship between this work and the sort of campus experience, especially one kind of like the time when you were developing this project, and maybe the role that this type of work plays on the way that students sort of have their academic lives in a campus that maybe is at a higher temperature than is typical. I ask this just because we're kind of in this environment right now, and everybody's kind of trying to be careful, and students are upset. So I guess, yeah, that's basically the question.
I mean, the other contextual factor that I didn't mention is that this all happened during the pandemic. So we weren't on campus, right? I mean, the George Floyd murder happened in May of 2020 when we were all on lockdown. And school was out already at this point. And so it's hard to speak to that specifically. I can say that it created a lot more urgency for the work that we wanted to do. So we hadn't yet received funding. I think we had already submitted our grant application. No, we were submitting our grant application when this was going on. But we'd been conceiving of the idea for a couple of years, and it just made everything feel that much more urgent. It was work that we really cared about prior to that, prior to George Floyd's murder, but that just sort of really motivated us. In terms of the students, I can speak to teaching during the Chauvin trial, which was very challenging. We had National Guards people stationed all over the city. They were in the parking lot of my grocery store with machine guns. I mean, they were expecting, because there was a police station nearby, they were expecting massive riots when they announced the verdict. And so there were armed people all over the place. Students were freaked out. Faculty were freaked out. So just regular students, we were freaked out. It was freaky. And we were scared. We were scared that the verdict was going to go in Chauvin's favor and that it was just things were going to erupt. Luckily, they didn't. Luckily, Chauvin was convicted. But what was interesting, one day in class, I was still teaching online then, and I said something to my students. We were getting all these messages about how to support students during all of this. And I said something to my students in class, and I just said, look, I don't know what you're going through right now. I don't know what your past experiences are, what your present positionalities are. I said, but I'm here for you. I know that this is really, really hard. And I mentioned, I said, I saw armed guards at my supermarket this week, and I'm sure you're seeing the same thing. And I know this is a really, really hard thing to be going through, and I'm available if you need to talk. And I had students later, I got all kinds of heart emojis in the Zoom call, but I had students later tell me that I was the only one of their instructors who acknowledged what was going on. And so I would say, as you're going through difficult times on campus, just let your students know that you're aware that this is happening and that you're available. I think they really appreciate that. you know, they feel isolated and disconnected enough in their regular lives. And so just being a support for them and being compassionate, I think is, I know you're not asking for advice, but that,
That's, I mean, because I mean, I think the first knee-jerk reaction one might have is to say, okay, I'm just going to create a totally, artificial French world, and we're not going to talk about any of these things. And so, acknowledging what's actually happening and trying to connect that to the work that we do in the language classroom is great. But having even that idea that even that act that you performed, I think can, even though it's a small thing, it really makes a huge difference.
it makes a huge difference. And it gets to that multicultural group dynamics and identity piece that we were just talking about, that if we're not acknowledging the way that students are living in the world, then we're not doing the work of critical pedagogy or multiliteracies pedagogy or social justice. We're not doing that work. We have to see them. We have to acknowledge them and give them a space to be able to express who they are. So I think that's really important. Yeah.
But sorry to keep
That's okay.
blabbing, but it takes courage to do that. I think it takes.
Oh, I
courage
was so
to-
nervous.
Yeah.
My heart was pounding and my hands were shaking and I was really nervous. And I wasn't dealing with something nearly as contentious as what's happening right now. I mean, this is a very divisive situation that's going on. I think in Minneapolis, everybody was rallying. Everybody wanted to see Chauvin convicted. I mean, I didn't know anybody who didn't want him to be convicted. And so it was easier when everybody was sort of on the same side of the issue. I'm not sure how I would navigate this, but at least saying, I know this is a really difficult time. If you need resources, I can direct you to them. If you need to talk, I can listen. That can sometimes be enough. So, yeah.
We can take one more question.
No, that's it. Simon, anything from the Zoom people? In that case, I'd like to thank Professor Paisani one more time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Please, you can engage with her a little bit socially before you go, and
Yeah.
please do so.
Yeah,
Thank you
great.
again.
Thank you so much, everybody. Really appreciate it.